Good evening. Tonight, your journey begins where time slows down and every thought finds peace among endless rows of ancient scrolls. We travel to ancient Alexandria to spend this night in absolute harmony and silence. The warm light of the setting sun fell gently upon the columns of the library. Long shadows slowly crept across the marble floor as if stretching out and merging with the silence of the hall. Theon shifted his weight slowly from one foot to the other, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath his feet. In that vast space, everything felt majestic and calm. The high vaults overhead, the light reflecting from the polished surfaces of the scrolls, and the quiet scent of parchment mingled with the delicate aroma of wax. At the far end of the hall stood Zenodotus, his figure nearly blended into the shadows of the columns, and he seemed to be observing the gentle glow of the lamps as it settled over the neatly arranged scrolls. He did not hurry, nor did he speak loudly. His presence was steady and unhurried, like the breathing of the library itself. Theon quietly took a few steps forward, careful not to disturb the silence. In this hall, there was no need for haste. Every scroll, every page was an entire world, and there was no reason to rush. He approached a long table near the window. The rays of the setting sun lightly touched the surface of the parchment, and Theon watched as the light slowly glided across the carefully written lines of text. He lowered himself onto the bench and lifted the first scroll. The faint rustle of its pages, barely audible, filled the space around him. In every letter, in every stroke of the pen, there was something soothing, as if history itself were whispering to him. He listened to the warm air gently stirring the pages, to the slow solidifying of a drop of wax on the candlestick, forming a translucent, almost golden bead that quietly reflected the light. Theon felt his breathing gradually becoming slower, deeper, almost merging with the quiet rhythm of the library. He sat motionless, watching as the sunlight slowly withdrew and the lamps, softly placed along the shelves, began to fill the space with their warm glow. There were almost no sounds in the hall except for the quiet rustling of the scroll and the faint creak of marble under the foot of a passing librarian checking the order of the shelves. Everything seemed slowed, as though the library itself were breathing slowly and calmly together with Theon. He lifted his gaze and noticed how the gentle light fell upon the rows of scrolls. Each one was a carefully rolled history gathered from distant lands, from Egyptian papyri to scrolls brought from India. Yet today he did not hurry to read their contents. He simply observed how the light played upon the parchment, how the lines of text formed patterns almost like soft music that could be heard only with the heart. Zenodotus approached more closely, though just as quietly, preserving the harmony. He sat down beside Theon and glanced at the scroll he was holding. His eyes did not rush. He allowed himself simply to be present. "Evenings are always quiet," he said softly. "The light withdraws, and the library seems to fall slowly into sleep. Here one may simply listen, observe, feel the presence of knowledge. It is not necessary to understand it at once. It is enough to allow it to be near." Theon nodded, feeling each of Zenodotus's words dissolve into the air, blending with the scent of wax and parchment. He lowered his gaze to the scroll again, letting his eyes drift slowly across the neat lines of text, as if reading them not with his eyes alone, but with his whole body. Another lamp was slowly lit upon the table, its light subtly changed the shade of the scroll, playing with the shadows cast upon the marble. Theon watched as the shadow glided gently across the table, how its shape shifted almost imperceptibly. Everything unfolding felt soft and unhurried, like the breathing of the evening itself. He set the scroll back upon the table and slowly leaned against the back of the bench. Outside, the last sounds of the city were fading, and the library was left nearly empty, filled only with soft light and the faint whisper of pages. In that calm, Theon felt the day gradually turning into night. He remained seated without moving, allowing himself to dissolve into the space. Each moment lingered, as if the library itself were stretching time, so that anyone within it could feel its breath. The sun had almost disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving only a thin band of golden light that softly reflected against the marble of the library. Theon stood by the far window, slowly watching as the rays of the setting sun stretched across the long hall. Every reflection along the shelves seemed alive. Shadows glided gently over the rows of scrolls, barely touching their surfaces. The air felt dense, filled with the scent of aged parchment, a faint trace of wax, and the subtle coolness of evening marble. He took a step without hurry, feeling the cool floor beneath his feet. Theon did not rush. In this space, where time seemed to lengthen, each movement felt meaningful. The light of the lamps slowly fell across his hands, reflecting from the neatly rolled scrolls resting on the tables and creating soft, iridescent patterns upon the surface of the parchment. Zenodotus stood motionless beside the long table. His figure was partially wrapped in the shadows of the columns, his eyes following the gentle shifting of light across the scrolls. Theon observed the quiet grace of his hands, how calmly he sat, as though the library itself had slowed its breathing to match his rhythm. "Evening is always special," Zenodotus said quietly, as if unwilling to disturb the harmony. "At this hour, the library seems to pause. Even the scrolls listen to the light and the darkness." Theon nodded, allowing the words to dissolve into the air. He opened a scroll, but did not begin to read. Instead, he simply watched as his gaze drifted across the orderly lines of text, as the lamplight subtly altered the shade of the paper, turning the letters into faint silver glimmers. Every movement of his hands was slow, as if the parchment itself were slowing the flow of time. Soon, several scholars quietly appeared at the tables. They moved with great care, leaving almost no sound upon the marble. Theon saw one of them, a tall man with a long gray beard, unroll a scroll and slowly trace his finger along the lines. Another, slightly younger, gently turned pages, listening to their soft rustling. Theon felt a strange serenity settle over him. Even in the presence of others, there was no haste here. Everything was slow, calm, as if the space itself was filled with lightness and peace. He glanced again at the lamp. A drop of wax, frozen upon the candlestick, slowly stretched downward, forming an almost transparent golden bead. The sun had vanished now, and the lamplight softly shimmered, casting long, flowing shadows across the marble. "Do you see," Zenodotus said softly, "how they rid? Not a single gesture is hurried. Every movement becomes part of this space. Watch how the light plays with the paper, how the shadows fall, how the lamps flicker. There is no rush here, no worry, only the breathing of the library." Theon closed his eyes for a moment. He heard the gentle rustle of pages, the nearly imperceptible creak of marble beneath a scholar's step. Everything around him echoed one slow rhythm, Like quiet breathing, his own breath deepened, slowed, and merged with this steady, silent flow. He opened his eyes and looked once more at the scroll. The lines of text seemed almost alive in the soft lamplight. Theon allowed his gaze to drift across the letters without trying to understand or analyze them, simply sensing their shape and rhythm. The scholars moved slowly through the hall. They did not speak loudly. Their voices were only a soft background murmur, like the whisper of wind. One philosopher gently placed a scroll on the table and sat beside another lamp. Theon watched the light fall across his face and hands, saw how the shadows subtly shifted, how even the man's breathing seemed slower. Zenodotus leaned slightly closer and said, "Here, in these quiet evenings, words are not needed. It is enough simply to be, to listen to the rustle of pages, to observe the light, to feel the space around you." Theon closed his eyes again. He felt himself slowly dissolving into this rhythm. Everything became soft, almost dreamlike. The warm golden light of the lamps reflected upon shelves, scrolls, marble. He heard the faintest sounds, the whisper of parchment, a muted creak of wood, the subtle breath of evening air. A few minutes passed. Then several scholars quietly departed, leaving Theon and Zenodotus alone. The silence deepened, yet it was not empty. It was filled with light, gentle sounds, and a sense of calm. Theon leaned back against the bench, holding the scroll in his lap. He did not try to read, did not try to think, did not try to do anything at all. He simply observed how the lamplight flickered upon the paper, how the drop of wax slowly changed shape, how shadows glided smoothly across the marble. Zenodotus sat motionless, as though he had become part of the space itself. He turned his head slightly, looked at Theon, and quietly said, "Even if others are present, even if there are sounds, the library knows how to preserve stillness. Here one can remain with oneself, with breath, with light, simply listening, watching, being." Theon closed his eyes once more. He felt his thoughts growing softer, his body gradually relaxing. The lamplight played gently upon the scrolls, creating long, unhurried reflections. Even the smallest movement of his hand seemed stretched in time. He remembered the drop of wax, slowly solidifying, reflecting the light. It seemed to him that the entire space was filled with this slow current of time, and that even his breathing had become part of this harmony. Theon opened his eyes again. His gaze moved along the rows of scrolls, across the columns, through the soft glow of the lamps. He watched as each scroll, each line of text, each shadow became part of one steady current. There was no hurry here, no anxiety, no need to think or act. There was only the sensation of presence, slow even, calm. More time passed. Theon leaned lightly upon the table and observed how the lamplight shimmered across the scrolls. He felt that the entire hall was breathing with him, that every sound, every shadow, every glimmer of light formed a gentle, soothing harmony. Zenodotus quietly rose and walked to a nearby lamp. He adjusted a scroll slightly, set it carefully upon the table, and sat again. Everything unfolded slowly, smoothly, almost imperceptibly, and yet it was precisely this that created the feeling of complete peace. Theon allowed himself to dissolve fully into the evening. His eyes drifted across lines of text, soft light, flowing shadows. Every moment lasted long, stretching outward and filling the space with quiet harmony. "When night arrives," Zenodotus said softly, "the library seems to prepare for sleep, but for those who remain, it becomes almost alive. One can watch the light, hear the whisper of pages, see how the shadows glide gently, and feel that time flows slowly, steadily, calmly. Theon closed his eyes, letting the words settle within him. He felt his body becoming lighter, his breath even, his thoughts slowing. The lamps flickered softly, their glow resting upon scrolls, while the slow whisper of pages created an almost hypnotic rhythm. Evening gradually gave way to night. Theon remained seated at the table, immersed in contemplation. The soft, warm lamplight reflected from the marble floor, from the neatly arranged scrolls, from the drops of wax upon the candlesticks. The entire space breathed slowly, quietly, peacefully. And within this gentle harmony, Theon felt complete tranquility. No rush, no noise, only soft light, the rustle of pages, the breathing of the library, and time flowing slowly onward. Night descended upon Alexandria slowly and quietly. The streets of the city were nearly empty now, and the occasional lantern barely illuminated the stone roads. Only the soft light of the moon filtered through the tall windows of the library, reflecting upon the marble columns and the shelves lined with neatly arranged scrolls. In the vast hall there reigned complete silence, not the kind that frightens, but the kind that wraps itself around you with warmth and gentle calm. Theon sat on a long bench, several scrolls laid out before him. His hands were relaxed, his gaze drifting softly along the lines of text, though he made no attempt to read. Instead, he listened to the space around him, the quiet whisper of pages, the faint creak of the floor, the subtle breathing of the library itself. Every sound, every flicker of light seemed meaningful, significant, as though the library were telling him its secrets. Zenodotus approached quietly and sat beside him, holding a carefully rolled scroll in his hands. His movement was slow, almost imperceptible, yet it created the sense that time here flowed differently. Night is the most fitting time for study, he said, barely moving his lips. The secret archives, the ancient scrolls, the ones rarely opened during the day, they reveal their mysteries only to those who know how to listen to silence. Theon nodded, feeling his breathing become steadier, slower. He allowed himself to dissolve completely into the space, to sense the softness of the light, the warmth of the lamps, the faint aroma of parchment and wax. The secret archives were located in the far wing of the library. Theon and Zenodotus walked there slowly, step by step, as though each step stretched time itself. Their shadows fell gently upon the floor, gliding along the columns, and the quiet echo of their footsteps blended almost imperceptibly with the whisper of pages. When they reached the heavy door, Zenodotus paused. He leaned slightly forward and, carefully turning the key, unlocked it. The door creaked softly, more like a sigh than a sound. Inside, a chamber opened before them, filled with shelves of ancient scrolls coated with a thin layer of dust. The dim light of a lamp illuminated the narrow passages between the rows, casting long, gentle shadows. Here are kept scrolls gathered from across the world, Zenodotus whispered, from Egypt to India, from Syria to Greece. They are quiet and still, but if you listen closely, you can hear their stories. Theon stepped slowly into the archive. Each movement was careful, so as not to disturb the silence. He reached out and lightly touched one of the scrolls. The parchment felt soft, warm, faintly rustling beneath his fingers. He inhaled the scent of old parchment mingled with warm wax, and felt the world outside the library dissolve. Zenodotus sat at the edge of a table and placed a scroll before him, carefully unrolling it. The lamplight shimmered across the golden lines of text. Theon watched a drop of wax slide slowly down a candlestick, changing shape as it barely touched the surface. Every moment here seemed stretched, as if time no longer flowed in its usual way. "Look," Zenodotus said softly, "these scrolls do not hurry to reveal their secrets. One must simply remain nearby, listen to the rustling of pages, feel their breathing." Theon sat beside him, holding a scroll once more. He did not read. He allowed his eyes to glide slowly over the lines of text, noticing every detail. The play of light upon parchment, the faint shimmer of ink, the soft shadows stretching across the table. The archive was utterly quiet. Only the faint rustle of parchment and the occasional soft sound of a drop of wax falling from a candlestick suggested the presence of something living, almost like the breathing of the library itself. At night, everything here is different, Zenodotus continued. During the day there is haste, noise, the footsteps of scholars. That is one thing. But when night arrives, the library speaks to itself. Scrolls whisper to one another, shadows dance slowly, light plays upon the pages, and all of this can be heard only if you are quiet and calm. Theon closed his eyes again. He felt his breathing slow, his muscles relax, each thought dissolving into the soft light and silence. He allowed himself to sink into the rhythm, nearly forgetting that he himself existed. Zenodotus gently unrolled another scroll. His hands moved slowly, carefully, as if unwilling to disturb an invisible harmony. Theon watched the motion, the soft shimmer of light upon parchment, the long shadows sliding along the shelves. Much time passed. Theon remained still, observing the drops of wax, the quiet whisper of pages, the interplay of light and shadow. Each scroll seemed alive, every line of text like a slowly breathing story. Suddenly, he noticed one scroll shift slightly as a light current of air slipped between the shelves. The lamp's shadow fell softly across the text, and Theon felt an almost magical presence, something ancient and wise. He inhaled the scent of old parchment mingled with warm wax and felt the night grow softer, calmer, longer. "Do you see?" Zenodotus said quietly. "Night is the hour when the library opens its secrets. Do not hurry, do not read. Simply listen." Theon closed his eyes, allowing himself to dissolve entirely within the space. He heard the nearly imperceptible whisper of pages, the soft creak of the floor, the quiet breathing of Zenodotus beside him. Everything around them was slow, steady, gentle. Each sound, each glimmer of light, each drop of wax created a sense of complete tranquility. He opened his eyes and looked along the rows of scrolls. The lamps flickered softly, reflecting upon parchment and casting long, flowing shadows. Theon watched the rhythm almost like music, slow, calm, quiet. Several hours passed. He remained motionless, neither reading nor moving, simply sensing the space around him. Lamplight reflected from marble floors, from scrolls, from droplets of wax. The whisper of pages became almost hypnotic, gently lulling his thoughts. Zenodotus rose and walked along the rows, quietly ensuring everything was in its place. His movements were gentle and unhurried, each hand carefully touching the scrolls. He did not rush, did not raise his voice. Everything that happened was part of a unified rhythm, the breathing of the library, the soft glow of light, the whisper of pages. Theon closed his eyes again as night softly enveloped the hall. He felt his breathing steady and slow, his body relaxing. every moment stretched outward, every movement of light and shadow becoming part of a single current. He listened as the faint whisper of pages blended with the gentle flicker of lamps. As drops of wax fell softly, barely touching the surface, everything around him seemed alive, breathing slowly, evenly, calmly. Within this rhythm, Theon felt he was no longer merely an observer. He had become part of the library itself, its breath, its light, its slow and gentle time. Night continued. The scrolls whispered quietly, the light shimmered softly, shadows glided across the marble. Theon sat motionless, dissolving into the rhythm, surrendering to complete serenity. He no longer thought, no longer analyzed, no longer sought to understand. There was only light, the whisper of pages, drops of wax, and the soft, steady silence. Night wrapped the library in a dense, gentle covering. The lamps barely illuminated the shelves, creating long, warm shadows that slowly drifted along marble columns and floor. Every glimmer of light falling upon a scroll seemed alive, as if the light itself breathed together with Theon. He sat on the bench, holding one of the scrolls from the far archive. The parchment was thin, almost translucent, with faint golden lines of text. Theon did not attempt to read. He simply watched how the light shimmered across the letters, how each drop of wax upon a candlestick reflected its glow across the shelves. Zenodotus quietly walked along the row, checking the order of the scrolls. His movements were soft, slowed, as if the library itself dictated the rhythm. Theon felt his breathing merge with that slow current. Inhale, exhale, soft motion of light and shadow, gentle whisper of pages. Look, Zenodotus said unhurriedly, each scroll here carries not only words, but the breath of the past. It becomes audible only to those who know how to listen to silence. Theon closed his eyes. He felt a faint trembling in his hands from tension that gradually melted away into calm. He allowed himself to dissolve into the lamplight, into the gentle rustling of pages, into the shimmering reflection of wax. Slowly, he opened his eyes again. The lines of text seemed to float in the lamplight. Every movement of his gaze was slow, every breath extended. He noticed how a drop of wax barely altered its shape, how its golden surface softly reflected the light. He lowered his gaze to a shelf of rare scrolls gathered from across the world. He let his eyes move slowly over them, noticing each curve of parchment, each shadow, each line of text. Everything felt like a soft, unhurried symphony. At night, everything here is different, Zenodotus said quietly as he sat beside him. During the day there is noise and haste, but at night the library reveals its secrets. Scrolls whisper to each other, light plays upon the pages, shadows dance slowly, and all this can be felt only if you are calm. Theon once again closed his eyes, letting the words dissolve within him. He felt his body gradually relax, his breathing become light and even. The whisper of pages, the faint creak of the floor, and the soft flicker of lamps created the feeling of an almost magical sleep that had not yet begun but already filled the space. He opened his eyes and watched the lamplight fall upon the edge of the scroll. Each line of text, each curved letter seemed slowly moving, almost alive. Theon allowed his gaze to drift across them without seeking meaning, sensing only the rhythm of light and shadow. Minutes passed, then an hour. The hall remained nearly empty. Occasionally a faint creak revealed the quiet step of a librarian checking the order. Lamplight shimmered upon shelves, scrolls, marble columns. Every movement of light and shadow was smooth, slow, almost invisible, yet essential to the sense of peace. Theon allowed himself to dissolve completely into the rhythm. His breathing merged with the breathing of the library, with the soft rustling of pages, with drops of wax falling upon candlesticks. Everything felt alive, breathing slowly, steadily, gently. Zenodotus unrolled another scroll and carefully traced his finger along the lines. Theon observed the movement, the soft play of light upon parchment, the long shadows gliding across the floor. Everything was part of a single, slow current that soothed both mind and body. The archive was utterly quiet. Even the breathing of Theon and Zenodotus seemed united with the space. The lamps flickered gently, reflecting upon the scrolls and creating long, flowing lines of light. Theon allowed himself to dissolve entirely into this world. He felt himself slowly slipping toward a state almost like sleep. Lamplight shimmered upon parchment. Drops of wax quietly solidified. Pages rustled faintly, creating a rhythm that could be heard only with the heart. Several more hours passed. Theon remained motionless, watching the interplay of light and shadow, the soft flicker of lamps, the nearly inaudible whisper of pages. Everything was slow, calm, almost hypnotic. Zenodotus quietly stood, ensured all scrolls were in their places, adjusted a few droplets of wax upon the candlesticks, and returned to his seat. His movements were gentle and slowed, part of the unified rhythm of the space. Theon closed his eyes once more. He allowed himself to dissolve into the current, felt his breathing slow, his body relax, his thoughts gradually fade. The lamplight shimmered across the scrolls, shadows glided along the floor, and the whisper of pages created almost magical rhythm that calmed the mind. He felt the night filling the space with soft silence, every sound, every drop of wax, every movement of light becoming part of harmony. Theon allowed himself to dissolve into that rhythm, sensing that he was no longer just an observer, but part of the library itself, its breath, its light, its slow, flowing time. Slowly, night deepened into profound stillness. Lamps flickered gently upon marble and parchment. Drops of wax fell softly. The whisper of pages was nearly imperceptible, yet the rhythm remained, slow even, gentle. Theon sat unmoving, dissolving into that rhythm, surrendering to complete tranquility. He no longer thought, analyzed, or sought to understand. He remained only with the breathing of the library, with light, with the soft whisper of pages, with slowly falling drops of wax, and the warm golden glow of lamps. Within that slow current, Theon felt a profound peace beyond words. The night seemed endless. The library felt alive, slow, gentle, vast, a place where one could remain alone with oneself, with breath, with light, with silence.